Good evening, and welcome back to this quiet space where time slows down and the heavy grey curtain of the modern world can finally be set aside. Take a long, slow breath. Feel the tension dissolve from your shoulders and let your mind settle into the absolute stillness of the room around you. Tonight, we are journeying into a landscape shaped by ancient shadows, vast wetlands, and endless forests wrapped in silver mist. We are stepping back into an era that sits on the precarious border between memory and imagination to ask a question that has puzzled historians and dreamers for more than 1,000 years. Why did the world forget the real King Arthur? And what is the silent, unvarnished truth that lies deep beneath the thick layers of medieval myth and coastal fog? If you find comfort in these midnight journeys through the past, please take a moment to like, subscribe, or leave a quiet thought below. Your support is like adding wood to a campfire. It helps other weary travelers find their way to our little sanctuary, one restful soul at a time. But for now, no more actions are needed. Let your shoulders drop, allow your breathing to slow down, and feel the weight of your eyelids. Just listen and let your mind float as we trace the fading footprints of history and listen to the echoes left behind. When we think of King Arthur today, our minds are naturally filled with brilliant, cinematic images of towering stone castles with silken banners snapping in the wind, noble knights clad in polished plate armor that gleams beneath a bright summer sun, and a grand court at Camelot defined by chivalry, romance, and impeccable order. We picture a flawless kingdom where justice is absolute, a magical wizard watches over the throne, and a legendary sword guarantees safety to all who dwell within its borders. But if you want to understand the true origin of this story, you must completely strip away the golden tapestries, the heavy stone fortresses, and the glittering courtly manners invented centuries later by French poets and romantic novelists. You must go back to a time long before the first medieval castle was ever built, to a wilderness that was dark, fractured, and cold. Imagine the island of Britannia in the early decades of the 5th century. For nearly 400 years, this land had been the outermost edge of the massive Roman Empire. The Britons had grown used to the comfort of stone roads, heated baths, organized laws, and the steady, protective presence of iron-clad Roman legions stationed along their northern walls. But as the colossal weight of Rome began to collapse under its own internal decay, and the relentless pressure of barbarian invasions closer to home, an order went out from the central government. The final Roman soldiers gathered their weapons, packed their heavy leather tents, and marched south toward the waiting ships, abandoning Britannia forever. In a matter of weeks, a civilization that had taken centuries to build simply evaporated into the damp northern air. The grand Roman villas were left empty, their mosaic floors slowly covered by creeping ivy and damp moss. The stone aqueducts fell into disrepair, and the roads that once carried imperial couriers became dangerous trails reclaimed by the dense oak forests. Britannia was suddenly cast into a profound, terrifying vacuum of power. It was no longer a unified province, but a collection of small, vulnerable tribal territories ruled by minor warlords, local tyrants, and desperate chieftains who fought bitterly among themselves for the remaining scraps of Roman authority. To make matters worse, across the cold grey waves of the North Sea, foreign eyes were watching. Maritime raiders known as the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes looked at the defenceless, fertile shores of Britannia and saw an opportunity. They arrived first in small numbers, their long wooden boats cutting through the coastal mist, carrying fierce warriors hungry for land and plunder. They raided the coastal settlements, burned the wooden villages, and slowly began to push deeper into the interior valleys, clearing the native Britons from their ancestral homes. This was the real world that gave birth to the legend. There were no grand tournaments or courtly love here. There was only a grim daily struggle for cultural survival, a desperate defense conducted by a forgotten people who were caught between the encroaching tide of Saxon steel and the deep, silent expanse of their own wilderness. To understand how the memory of this brutal transition was lost, one must observe the vast difference between the real individuals of the 5th century and the literary archetypes that replaced them. The transformation did not happen overnight. It was a slow, gradual accumulation of stories told around the fires of a collapsing world, where historical fact was the first sacrifice made to guarantee psychological survival. The native Britons, stripped of their imperial protectors, found themselves entirely isolated on an island that was rapidly being swallowed by darkness. The refined urban centres that had once defined Roman Britain became ghostly ruins where people no longer lived, as the population fled into the hills and ancient woodland strongholds to escape the marauding coastal raiders. In this chaotic descent into tribal fragmentation, the old records were destroyed, the libraries were burned, and the continuity of written history was broken. For generations, the only bridge connecting the past to the present was the vocal memory of travelling bards and tribal elders who preserved the deeds of their defenders in poetic verse. These early songs did not speak of chivalry or holy grails. They spoke of blood, mud, hunger, and the unyielding necessity of holding the frontier against an endless wave of invaders. It was a world stripped of ornament, where a leader was valued not for the purity of his bloodline or the grace of his courtly manners, but for his ability to organize a shield wall and survive the coming winter. In this silent expanse of history, the early chronicles indicate that the resistance of the Britons was not led by a hereditary monarch wearing a golden crown, but by a military commander who operated within the remnants of the Roman administrative system. He was an individual who looked at the fragmented tribes and realized that their only hope for survival lay in a radical departure from traditional foot soldier tactics. He gathered a specialized force of mobile horsemen, training them in the disciplined, coordinated maneuvers of the late Roman cavalry vanguards, creating an elite strike force that could move across the island with incredible speed to intercept coastal incursions before the invaders could establish a secure foothold. This practical commander did not fight for glory or an idealized vision of a spiritual kingdom. He fought for time, knowing that every season he held the line was a season where the fields could be harvested and the language of his ancestors could continue to be spoken. This was the true face of the man beneath the myth, a pragmatist operating in the ruins of a broken world, whose authority was balanced entirely on the edge of his iron sword and the unyielding discipline of his riders. The world forgot him because his reality was too cold, too desperate, and too complicated for later generations to celebrate, preferring instead the comfortable illusion of a perfect king who ruled a world without flaws. The environment of Britannia during this period of resistance was defined by its absolute isolation, a landscape where the vast wetlands and impenetrable forests created natural barriers that dictated the movement of both defenders and invaders. The Somerset levels, a massive expanse of tidal marshes and low-lying moorlands, became the strategic heart of the British defence, a labyrinth of reeds and dark water where the Saxon invaders could not easily manoeuvre their traditional infantry formations. It was a territory wrapped in a perpetual grey haze, where the boundaries between earth and sky seemed to dissolve entirely into the damp air, creating a natural fortress that protected the remaining British clans from total annihilation. To explore the truth behind the fog is to realise that the legendary locations of the Arthurian narrative were not grand stone cities built on high peaks, but hidden encampments of wood and turf established within these swampy sanctuaries. The real defenders lived a life of constant vigilance, their ears trained to catch the distant, hollow sound of an enemy horn cutting through the quiet of the marshlands, their weapons never far from their hands even in the deepest hours of the night. This intense relationship between the people and their unyielding geography provided the raw material for the later legends of magical islands and hidden kingdoms, transforming a practical defensive strategy into a mystical realm where time and space operated under different laws. As the decades of conflict wore on, this frontier commander succeeded in forging a temporary unity among the fiercely independent British chieftains, convincing them to lay down their ancestral rivalries to face the existential threat gathered on their eastern borders. He established a network of signalling stations along the ancient ridges, utilizing fire and smoke to coordinate the defenses of a dozen different territories. creating a unified front that stunned the Saxon kings, who were used to fighting isolated tribal entities. This achievement was not the result of magical intervention or divine mandate. It was the product of relentless political diplomacy, strategic engineering, and the sheer force of a single individual's determination to preserve the remnants of his culture. The old manuscripts whisper of a golden age of peace that followed these efforts, a brief window of 20 years where the tide of invasion was successfully turned back and the island drew a collective breath of relief in the dark. It was a fragile, hard-won stability that allowed the ordinary people to return to their fields, to rebuild their wooden villages, and to imagine a future where the darkness did not automatically conquer the light. But the peace they enjoyed was a temporary shelter built against the vastness of time, a moment of stillness that contained the first subtle seeds of its own eventual dissolution. As the old warlords grew restless in their quiet halls, and the memories of the early slaughters began to fade from the minds of the younger generation. The true by-kitch of this era is that the very success of Arthur's defense guaranteed the erasure of his historical reality, as the people he saved converted his practical achievements into a mythical shield to guard against future despair. When the long peace eventually fractured and the inevitable advance of the Saxon armies resumed in the centuries that followed, the native Britons found themselves driven into the mountainous strongholds of Wales and Cornwall, their culture systematically marginalised by the rising kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxons. In their exile, they clung to the memory of the commander who had once given them victory, passing his story down through the generations like a sacred relic, altering the details with every retelling to match the increasing desperation of their political situation. The real war leader who used Roman tactics was quietly transformed into an immortal emperor who would one day wake from his long sleep to restore the ancient liberties of the island, a prophecy that provided comfort to a conquered people but buried the actual historical figure beneath a mountain of brilliant fiction. The world forgot the real Arthur because it needed a myth more than it needed a man, choosing the absolute certainty of a legendary blade over the fragile, anxious choices of a real human being who had bled upon the hills of Britain to buy his people one more season of safety in the dark. As the winter mist rolls in from the ancient marshes of Somerset and wraps its cold fingers around the lonely ruins of the past, the distinction between what was real and what was dreamed begins to dissolve entirely, leaving behind only a faint, persistent whisper that echoes through the quiet woods, waiting for someone to listen. To walk through this quiet landscape with an open mind is to discover that the ordinary textures of the 5th century were far more complex and evocative than any polished castle of medieval fiction. The world that surrounded the young Arthur during his earliest years was not a place of silk cushions and courtly banquets, but an environment composed of damp timber, rough-woven wool, and the constant presence of shifting fog. Imagine waking just before dawn in a traditional British timber longhouse, nestled deep within the dense oak forests of Western Britain. The air inside is thick and heavy, saturated with the strong scent of drying moss, wood smoke from the central hearth, and the bitter, sharp aroma of elderberry wine stored in large clay jars near the door. There is no sound of stringed instruments or refined poetry cutting through the darkness. Instead, listen closely to the raw domestic symphony of this frontier survival. You can hear the rhythmic, raspy breath of hunting dogs sleeping in the dry straw beneath the benches, the hollow clatter of clay bowls being stacked by a servant near the well, and the low, continuous sigh of the wind moving through the thick thatch roof overhead. Outside the main timber doors, the physical world begins to reveal itself in the weak, watery light of a northern winter morning. Walk out into the courtyard of the settlement and feel the sudden, sharp drop in temperature as the damp cold settles into your skin. The ground beneath your leather boots is not flat stone, but an uneven expanse of dark, frozen clay, caked with old mountain straw and gravel, thrown down to hold back the mud. Look closely at the small sensory details that define this hard-won sanctuary. You can see the thin layer of white frost silvering the tops of the split pine palisades that encircle the huts, and the slow, heavy columns of grey smoke rising from the central roof openings to merge with the low canopy of the clouds. Near the forge, a local blacksmith is already at work, the rhythmic, metallic ring of his iron hammer striking a red-hot iron spearhead, creating a steady, hypnotic pulse that echoes off the surrounding hills. The air here smells strongly of charcoal kilns, wet leather saddles hanging from pine pegs, and the raw, heavy scent of horse manure from the nearby stables. This was the authentic texture of Britannia, a society that spent its days working with wood and bone, where every object was crafted by calloused fingers and held a direct, practical purpose in the continuous struggle to maintain life against the elements. In the center of this rustic, watchful community, the old chronicles tell of a child whose true origin was wrapped in such deep political necessity and secrecy that his identity was deliberately concealed from the world. The boy who would become Arthur did not grow up inside a royal palace surrounded by heralds and advisors who celebrated his lineage. He was placed as an foster child into the household of a modest country warlord, raised under the pretense of an ordinary youth with no grand expectations. This choice was not an act of neglect, but a strategic move designed by the counsellor Merlin to shield the child from the immediate, lethal rivalries of the tribal kings, who would have gladly ended his line to secure their own regional monopolies of power. To experience the atmosphere of this hidden childhood, imagine a young boy walking alone through the dense, overgrown trails of the western valleys during a late autumn twilight. He wears a simple tunic of rough, undyed wool that scratches against his skin. His hands calloused from carrying firewood and tending to the small mountain cattle that provided the settlement with milk and hide. He does not know that the blood of imperial commanders cuts through his veins, nor does he understand that his name is already being written down by distant scribes as the final hope of a fractured people. His world is measured entirely by the immediate boundary of the forest, the warmth of the longhouse hearth, and the seasonal migration of the red deer through the valleys. Watch the boy as he pauses on a high granite outcrop overlooking the wide expanse of the marshlands, his fingers tracing the rough texture of a wooden training sword his foster brother had carved for him from a fallen ash branch. The air around him is quiet and cold, smelling of pine needles, wet slate, and the faint, clean scent of river water moving through the reeds below. He does not possess the flawless, effortless grace of a literary hero. He is a real youth, his skin tanned by the harsh northern sun and scarred by the thorny thickets of the interior wilderness. He spends his days learning the practical skills of the frontier, how to read the tracks of wild boars in the mud, how to find dry firewood beneath a canopy of rain-soaked oaks, and how to stay perfectly silent when a strange hunting party moves through the valley below. This continuous, intimate contact with the raw geography of Britannia shaped his character far more deeply than any formal education could have done, instilling in his mind a profound reverence for the seasonal rhythms of the land and a quiet, resilient endurance that would define his future leadership. He grew up as part of the wilderness itself, a child of the mist, who looked at the ancient stone ruins left behind by the Romans, not with a sense of loss, but as a silent reminder that everything built by human hands must eventually find its way back to the earth. The peace of this hidden childhood was, however, balanced on a precarious threshold as the political chaos in the wider territories of Britannia began to reach a critical, volatile climax. The High Chieftain Uther Pendragon, the man whose chaotic alliances had briefly held the southern tribes together, had passed away without leaving an acknowledged successor to his seat of authority. In the vacuum left behind by his departure, the local warlords and regional kings immediately pulled down their shared banners and began a bitter, unyielding civil war to claim the title of supreme leader. To understand the gravity of this crisis, imagine the interior of an ancient stone sanctuary built by the Romans, now abandoned and converted into a meeting hall for the desperate tribal chieftains. The walls are made of cold, grey blocks of stone caked with soot from torches, and the mosaic floor depicting ancient pagan gods is cracked and dirty, covered in a thin layer of mountain clay brought in by the heavy leather boots of the soldiers. The chieftains sit in a wide circle, their faces hardened by generational hatred and mutual suspicion, their hands never far from the iron hilts of their swords, as they debate who among them possesses the necessary strength and lineage to lead the Federation. The air inside is toxic with pride, smelling of stale grease, wood smoke, and the damp wool of cloaks caked in the grey mud of a dozen different battlefields. It was during this dark, stagnant impasse that Merlin chose to introduce his radical catalyst into the political arena, utilising a physical symbol that would completely bypass the greedy, self-serving arguments of the chieftains. He led the council out into the cold courtyard of the sanctuary, where a massive block of unhewn granite had been placed during the night, its surface smooth and dark beneath the winter clouds. Driven deep into the centre of the living stone was an iron blade, a beautifully balanced cavalry sword whose hilt was unadorned by jewels, carrying only the simple, geometric lines of a master artisan's craft. Encircling the base of the stone was an inscription chiselled into the granite, declaring that whoever could draw this weapon from its rocky cradle was the legitimate, divinely chosen sovereign of the entire island. Watch the great kings and regional champions as they step forward one by one to test their muscle against the unyielding stone, their faces turning crimson with exertion, their boots slipping in the mud as they attempt to move the iron hilt through sheer brute force. Listen to the heavy, collective breathing of the crowd as each warrior fails, the sword remaining perfectly motionless within the granite. A silent, unyielding monument that seems to mock their personal ambition and pride. They look at the blade not as a trust to be guarded, but as a prize to be conquered, proving through their very failure that they are fundamentally unworthy to wield its authority. When the young Arthur finally stepped into the circle, he did not enter with the grand ceremony of a royal claimant. He walked into the centre of the council merely because his foster brother had misplaced his weapon before a local skirmish, and the boy had been sent to find a replacement in the hurry of the morning. The air around the stone was perfectly silent, the thick winter fog hanging low over the courtyard, reducing the assembled kings to a mute audience of shadows, wrapped in heavy cloaks. Imagine the sudden, breathless tension of that moment as the youth placed his calloused hand upon the cold iron pommel of the sword. He did not call upon magical incantations or seek the validation of the watching crowd. He simply closed his fingers around the leather-wrapped grip and pulled with the natural, fluid coordination he had learned while working in the interior forests. Listen to the specific, astonishing sound that followed a clean metallic scrape as the iron blade slid effortlessly out of the granite socket, a single, sharp ring that seemed to vibrate through the very earth beneath their feet. The boy stood in the center of the mud, the heavy blade balanced perfectly in his hand, its polished surface reflecting the pale light of the sky, completely unaware that his simple action had just shattered the ancient tribal hierarchies of Britannia and set his feet upon an unyielding path of glory and sacrifice. The reaction of the gathered chieftains was not an instantaneous shout of acclamation, but a profound, hostile silence that lasted for several minutes as their minds struggled to accept the reality of what their eyes had just witnessed. They looked at the unknown youth, his simple wool tunic caked in mud, his face marked by the grey haze of the wilderness, and felt a deep, volatile surge of resentment grip their hearts. To submit to an elite champion or a powerful regional monarch was something their pride could endure, but to kneel before a nameless foster child from the Western Hills seemed like an insult to their ancient lineages and personal achievements. They demanded that the weapon be placed back into the stone, attempting to prove that the boy's success was a temporary illusion or a trick engineered by the advisor Merlin. Watch Arthur as he calmly steps forward once again, his movements deliberate and unhurried, sliding the iron blade back into the chiseled granite socket with absolute precision. Twice more the great kings failed to move the hilt, their heavy hands straining against the stone until their muscles failed them, and twice more the young foster child drew the steel forth with the same quiet, effortless grace, leaving no room for doubt or denial. The choice of the land was absolute, a silent declaration that true authority was not found in the inheritance of a golden crown, but in the possession of a balanced, unselfish spirit that could align itself with the unyielding necessities of the island's survival. The choice of the land was absolute, a silent declaration that true authority was not found in the inheritance of a golden crown, but in the possession of a balanced, unselfish spirit that could align itself with the unyielding necessities of the island's survival. When the young foster child stood before the ancient sanctuary, his fingers loosely curled around the iron grip of the freshly drawn blade. The pale winter sun broke through the heavy northern clouds for a fleeting moment, casting a sharp, cold reflection across the unpolished steel. But the initial amazement of the watching crowd was short-lived, rapidly replaced by a dark, volatile current of resentment that rippled through the ranks of the regional kings and tribal chieftains who stood wrapped in their heavy wool cloaks. To kneel before an elite warrior of proven lineage, or a wealthy monarch with 1,000 spears at his command, was a compromise their ancient pride could endure. But to submit to a nameless boy from the Western Hills felt like a terminal insult to their ancestral bloodlines. They loudly demanded that the weapon be returned to its rocky cradle, claiming that the child's success was a temporary illusion or an elaborate deception engineered by the advisor Merlin to rob them of their traditional sovereignty. Twice more Arthur calmly stepped forward into the grey, freezing mud, sliding the iron blade back into the chiseled granite socket with absolute precision. And twice more, the regional champions failed to move the hilt a single inch, while the youth drew the steel forth with the same quiet, effortless grace. Yet, despite this unyielding proof handled by the land itself, the long-dormant fires of tribal greed and mutual suspicion could not be so easily extinguished by a single symbolic event. The great warlords of the North and West, men who had spent decades carving out their own private empires from the ruins of Roman authority, refused to lay down their spears or abandon their dreams of supreme command. Kings like Lot of Lothian, Uriens of Gore, and the fierce tyrants of the Cornish coast pulled down the shared dragon banners of the British Federation, turning their horses away from the sanctuary courtyard with grim, silent oaths of open defiance. Britannia was cast almost instantly into a second, more tattered layer of internal conflict, a desperate civil war that threatened to completely dismantle the remaining defences of the native people, just as the Saxon longboats were gathering in unprecedented numbers along the eastern tides. To understand the true weight of this dark transition, one must completely look past the later romantic tales of noble tournaments and focus instead on the raw, grim reality of a collapsing frontier. Imagine the encampments of Arthur's small band of loyalists during those early, anxious months of the rebellion, nestled within the deep, waterlogged valleys where the freezing rain never fully ceased. There was no gold or silver courtly display here. There was only the heavy, oppressive atmosphere of a society fighting for its very breath. If you stood inside the young king's military tent during a late autumn midnight, the environment would be saturated with the specific, intense textures of a population preparing for an existential struggle. Listen closely to the restless, metallic sounds that echoed beneath the damp leather canopy. You can hear the continuous, rhythmic click of iron rings as armourers desperately repaired old Roman mail shirts, and the sharp, raspy sound of whetstones scraping against soft iron spearheads in the dim light of tallow candles. The air inside smelled strongly of damp grease used to waterproof the leather horse saddles, stale wood smoke from green ash logs burning fitfully in a shallow dirt pit, and the bitter, herbal aroma of dried yarrow used by the healers to pack open wounds. Arthur sat upon a rough wooden bench, his fingers tracing the contour of a hand-drawn map, caked in grey river clay, his face pale and lined with the sudden, immense burden of command. At his shoulder stood Merlin, a quiet shadow whose cold, analytical mind looked past the immediate danger of the rebellion to focus on the unyielding strategic geography of the island. Merlin understood that they could not win a conventional war of attrition against the combined forces of the rebel kings. They needed a radical departure from traditional foot soldier tactics, utilizing the disciplined, mobile cavalry formations that Arthur had studied within the old imperial military manuals. The primary tactical innovation that allowed the young king to survive this initial winter was the creation of a highly compact, elite vanguard of heavily armoured horsemen who could move through the trackless forests with incredible speed. intercepting the fragmented rebel forces before they could coordinate their separate armies into a single overwhelming host. When Arthur's riders moved through the western valleys, the sound of their advance was a disciplined, terrifying pulse, the rhythmic, synchronized thud of hundreds of iron horseshoes striking the frozen ground, a collective momentum that could shatter the traditional tribal shield walls through sheer shock and coordination. Watch the line as it plunges down a muddy ridge during a sudden morning skirmish along the banks of a northern river. The air is thick with a freezing suung mu that reduces the world to a narrow circle of white light, smelling of wet earth, iron sweat, and the sour scent of frightened horses. The impact was chaotic and Tranrui, a brutal collision of wood, muscle, and bone that lasted from the first light of dawn until the twilight returned to reclaim the valleys. Arthur fought at the centre of the charging wedge, his iron cavalry sword swinging in a low, pragmatic arc that carried no magical enchantments, only the cold, reliable weight of masterfully forged steel cutting through the defence of men who had forgotten the meaning of an oath. But where traditional warlords used victory as an opportunity for total slaughter, the extortion of tribute, and the burning of rival villages, Arthur's long-term strategy was defined by a revolutionary concept of absolute mercy and reconciliation. After each bloody engagement along the frontier, when the rebel lines had been scattered into the forests and the local chieftains stood bound as captives in the mud, the young king did not demand their execution or strip them of their ancestral territories. He would personally step into the longhouses of the defeated kings, cut their leather bonds with his own dagger, and invite them to sit down beside the central hearth, as equals to speak of a common future. Imagine the intense psychological tension of those meetings, the long shadows dancing across the log walls as the fire crackled in the dirt pit, the air smelling of roasting fat and the damp wool of cloaks caked in the grey clay of the battlefield. Arthur would speak to them not as a conqueror demanding submission, but as a fellow Briton who understood that every drop of native blood spilled in these private feuds was a victory gifted directly to the Saxon raiders who were watching from the eastern shores. He asked them to look past their private grudges and imagine a society where the strength of the soldier was used exclusively to maintain the laws of a unified federation, a vision that gradually transformed his former enemies into his most dedicated supporters. Through this continuous policy of defensive discipline and diplomatic generosity, a new inner circle of commanders began to coalesce around the young king, men who carried the heavy scars of survival and possessed a deep, personal reverence for Arthur's emerging ideals. There was Sir Kay, Arthur's foster brother, a pragmatic, iron-willed individual whose value lay not in grand rhetorical speeches, but in his absolute mastery of imperial logistics, his ability to manage the thunglung of supply lines and guarantee that the horses were fed and the iron stores were maintained through the darkest months of the year. Beside him stood Sir Bedivere, a warrior of immense physical presence, whose family had guarded the windswept granite cliffs of Cornwall for generations, a man whose loyalty to Arthur was as solid as the cliffs of his homeland. Watch Bedivere as he stands watch outside the Timber Council Hall during a winter storm, his fingers frozen around the shaft of his long ash spear, his eyes quiet and fixed upon the perimeter palisades, a silent monument of vigilance, who knew that the safety of their entire culture was balanced on the alertness of his gaze. These men were the first stones in the foundation of a new world, individuals who had looked into the chaos of the post-Roman vacuum and chosen to bind themselves to a leader who offered them something larger than personal plunder or local survival. With the internal rebellion successfully pacified through this delicate balance of steel and mercy, Merlin realized that the time had arrived to establish a permanent, centralized seat of authority that could serve as a physical manifestation of this unified British identity. They selected a vast, elevated hill fort in the West Country, a position that commanded a sweeping view of the strategic inland waterways and was naturally protected by a labyrinth of low-lying marshes and ancient oak forests. This Faudai was named Camelot, and its construction became an industries project that captured the imagination of the entire population, drawing craftsmen, stonecutters, and common labourers from every corner of the island to contribute their strength to the walls. There were no immaculate white marble towers or silken banners here. The real Camelot was a massive structure of rough-hewn oak logs, packed clay embankments, and cold grey fieldstone driven deep into the living earth. Listen to the rhythmic, industrious music that filled the valley during those long summer months of building. You can hear the sharp, metallic ring of iron axes clearing the pine groves on the ridges, the heavy creak of wooden cranes lifting massive timber beams into place using ropes made of braided hemp, and the low, continuous murmur of thousands of voices speaking a variety of Celtic dialects as they work side by side in the dust. The air around the construction site was thick with the smells of transformation, a sensory texture that combined the nong-hack aroma of boiling wood tar used to seal the palisades against the relentless northern rot, with the dense, sour smoke of charcoal ovens firing clay tiles for the longhouse roofs. At the centre of this emerging citadel, within the grand timber hall that served as the focal point for the king's administration, Merlin directed the creation of an object that would completely redefine the nature of human government in the Western world. He looked at the traditional rectangular tables found within the halls of the tribal chieftains, where the leader always sat at the highest position of privilege to reinforce his absolute dominance over his subordinates, and he understood that this layout was a permanent source of political friction and personal pride. He gathered the finest carpenters of Wales, commanding them to select a massive, ancient oak from the deepest part of the forest, to split its trunk into thick, interlocking planks, and to shape those segments into a flawless circle that carried no corners, no head, and no position of absolute dominance. The round table was completed, a physical manifestation of a sacred contract where every knight who sat at its edge would carry the exact same weight as the king himself, setting the stage for a brief, magnificent afternoon of order and justice before the inevitable shadow of human frailty returned to claim the world. The completion of this magnificent oak circle did not merely signify the end of a master carpenter's labour, it marked the quiet birth of an entirely new consciousness within the fractured territories of Britannia, anchoring the fragile alliance of the tribal chieftains to a physical centre that completely dissolved their ancient hierarchies. As the first official council was summoned to gather within the grand timber hall of Camelot, a profound stillness descended upon the high hill fort, the restless summer wind outside dropping to a gentle murmur as the late afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the packed clay courtyard. To look past the elaborate courtly tapestries of medieval legend and discover the raw reality of this inaugural gathering is to realize that these early guardians were not polished court gentlemen, but battle-hardened frontier veterans whose skin was permanently weathered by the freezing rains and whose leather tunics bore the deep scars of defensive warfare. They moved through the narrow log doorways not with the fluid grace of choreographed heralds, but with the heavy, deliberate footfalls of men caked in mounting clay, their iron mail shirts clicking softly with every motion, their hands resting instinctively near the hilts of their pragmatic, masterfully forged weapons. They approached the circular table with an intense, watchful gravity, their eyes scanning the dark grain of the English oak, searching for a false note or a hidden hierarchy, only to find a perfect, unyielding continuity that offered no head, no foot, and no position of absolute privilege to any individual bloodline. When each chieftain finally took his place around the oak circle, a collective hush fell over the longhouse, the dim light from the high roof openings catching the pale columns of smoke that rose steadily from the central hearth pit to mingle with the drying bundles of sweet clover hanging from the pine rafters. The environment inside was rich with the specific, domestic textures of a society attempting to remember the meaning of order, the clean, comforting aroma of fresh green rushes crackling softly beneath heavy leather boots, the sharp, pungent scent of beeswax candles burning fitfully on iron spikes, and the deep, underlying smell of split oak wood seasoned by the winter frost. Arthur sat among his commanders not as an omnipotent dictator demanding unthinking submission, but as a first among peers, a first among equals who understood that true authority was built upon the voluntary surrender of personal pride to the collective necessity of the Federation's survival. He placed his calloused hands upon the edge of the circular table, his eyes making direct, silent contact with every man in the room, from the powerful regional kings who ruled vast fertile valleys to the minor chieftains who guarded lonely granite towers in the distant hills. In that moment of intense shared stillness, the ancient grudges that had caused these clans to spill each other's blood for generations seemed to lose their grip, dissolved by the sheer structural power of a circle that forced every warrior to see his fellow companion as a reflection of his own vulnerability and strength. The voice of the young king, when he finally broke the silence, was not a roar of imperial defiance, but a low, resonant murmur that drifted through the timber hall, like a steady current, carrying the heavy weight of a sacred trust that required no ornament to enforce its truth. He asked the assembled warriors to lift their iron swords, to place the cold flats of their blades upon the dark oak wood of the table, and to repeat after him a solemn, unyielding covenant that would come to define the code of the Round Table for centuries to come. This oath was not a collection of abstract poetic virtues or romanticized courtly manners. It was a pragmatic, moral foundation designed to govern the volatile exercise of military power within a lawless wilderness. The knights swore to never turn their weapons against the innocent, to always offer shelter and protection to the weary traveller, to reject the ancient birthright of personal plunder and tribal conquest, and to defend the unified borders of Britannia until the day their blood returned to the soil. Listen to the deep, overlapping resonance of those voices as they spoke the words in unison. The low guttural Celtic dialects merging into a single, rhythmic pulse that seemed to vibrate through the very timber posts supporting the roof. It was a moment of profound transformation, a collective declaration that might no longer equal right, and that the true measure of a warrior's honour was found not in how many men he could force to kneel, but in how safely he could guard the peace of those who could not carry a sword. As the solemn echoes of the oath faded into the quiet air of the Longhouse, the reputation of this revolutionary brotherhood began to ripple outward from the hill fort of Camelot, crossing the stormy lanes of the North Sea and reaching the distant, war-torn courts of continental Europe, like a beacon of hope in a dark age. Restless spirits, elite mercenary horsemen, and displaced noble princes who had grown weary of the endless, unprincipled squabbles of the falling Western world turned their eyes toward the mist-wrapped island of Britannia, seeking to bind their fortunes to a king who measured victory through justice. Among these foreign arrivals, the old manuscripts celebrate the appearance of a young cavalry commander from the Romanized lands of continental Gaul, an individual whose name would become synonymous with both the highest peak of Camelot's military brilliance and the ultimate tragedy of its internal dissolution. Lancelot arrived at the timber gates of Camelot during a crisp, clear autumn morning, his long journey across the waves visible in the salt-stained leather of his riding boots and the deep fatigue etched into the lines of his youthful face. He did not arrive with a grand retinue of standard-bearers or silken carriages. He rode alone upon a powerful, compact warhorse, his elite, heavy lance balanced effortlessly across his stirrup, his iron-braced shield bearing no coat of arms, only the clean, unblemished grey of polished iron. To understand the immediate impact of Lancelot's presence within the developing Federation, one must observe the specific, disciplined textures of his military training, which contrasted sharply with the more erratic, emotional fighting styles of the native British clans. Watch him as he trains with the younger riders in the open courtyard of the fortress, the pale morning sunlight catching the rhythmic movement of his mail shirt as he demonstrates the precise, coordinated balance required to control a warhorse through the momentum of a heavy lance strike. The air in the courtyard smells strongly of turned earth, leather soap, and the sharp scent of crushed pine needles thrown down to stabilize the mud tracks. Lancelot moved with a fluid, economical efficiency that was the direct legacy of the old Roman military academies of Gaul, a style where every motion was calculated to maximize defense and preserve the endurance of both rider and beast. He did not seek to dominate his companions through arrogant displays of strength or reckless bravado. He sat at the circular table with a quiet, watchful humility, that deeply revered Arthur's vision, his absolute fidelity to the oath of the table making him the natural choice to lead the centralized cavalry vanguard that kept the distant frontiers secure. Beside the continental elegance of Lancelot stood the fierce, unyielding presence of the northern horseman, represented most completely by the king's own nephew, a young warrior of the granite cliffs named Gawain. Gawain was a child of the wild, windswept territories of Orkney, an environment defined by its freezing northern gales, rugged coastlines, and a tribal culture that had resisted the civilizing influence of Rome for centuries. He brought to the Round Table the raw, untamed energy of the northern wilderness, his concept of honor built upon an absolute, visceral loyalty to his kinship and his king, a loyalty that was as unbending as the ancient stone monuments that guarded his homeland. Watch him as he sits near Lancelot at the Oak Circle, the contrast between the two commanders, visible in every detail of their posture and equipment. Gawain's rough, grease-treated wool cloak smelling of coastal peat and whale oil, his hands calloused from gripping a heavy, broad-bladed battle-axe, his eyes dark and burning, with a restless intensity that always hungered for the open frontier. Yet, despite his volatile tribal pride, the structural magic of the circle held him in check, forcing him to channel his immense martial energy into the disciplined service of the Federation, becoming Arthur's most reliable shield against the persistent incursions of the northern raiders who attempted to breach the defensive walls. The integration of these diverse personalities around a single circular table allowed Camelot to enter a brief, golden afternoon of unprecedented societal stability, a window of 20 years where the shadow of total cultural extinction was successfully lifted from the population of Britannia. For the first time in more than a century, the ordinary people who inhabited the interior valleys could look toward the changing of the seasons without the constant, paralyzing terror of the midnight torch or the maritime raid. The green fields that had long been abandoned to thorn thickets and wild bogs were slowly cleared by human hands, the rich river silt turned over by wooden ploughs to grow wheat and barley in miraculous abundance. Listen to the changing, peaceful sounds that began to fill the rural landscapes surrounding the fortress. The slow, rhythmic lowing of mountain cattle being driven down to the fertile summer pastures, the melodic chanting of weavers working at their wooden looms in the small river settlements, and the laughter of children playing safely within the shadow of the timber palisades. The grand Roman roads that had fallen into rusty disrepair were cleared of debris, transforming once again into safe corridors of trade where local merchants could travel between tribal territories without the necessity of iron guards or heavy tributes, proving through their daily prosperity that the true value of an empire is found in the safety it guarantees to the humble. This internal security allowed Arthur to transition from a mobile war leader into a custodian of written law, utilizing the long years of peace to codify a system of justice that could survive the natural greed and volatility of the tribal chieftains. He worked closely with the remaining literate scribes and Christian monks who resided within the isolated sanctuaries, translating the complex administrative principles of the old Roman code into a simple, equitable system of laws that could be understood by the common people. Watch the king during a quiet winter evening as he sits beside his private hearth in the citadel, the cold wind howling outside the log fortifications, driving the freezing sleet against the split pine shutters. The room smells of dry ash wood burning slowly in the stone hearth, the sweet scent of dried lavender used to repel insects from the wool bedding, and the sharp ink made of oak galls and iron copperers. Arthur holds a small parchment scroll, his fingers tracing the Latin characters written by a clerk, his mind completely focused on how to balance the ancient tribal traditions of blood money and feuds with the revolutionary concept of an impartial, state-administered justice. He understood that the fortress he had built with wood and iron would eventually rot, but if he could engrave the concepts of law and equality into the hearts of his people, the memory of Camelot would remain immortal long after the logs had turned to dust. Unaware that the final piece of this structural stability would arrive not through a decree of law, but through a royal alliance that would bring a northern queen into the quiet centre of his hall. The arrival of this northern queen, whose lineage commanded the unyielding allegiance of the rugged territories beyond the Humber River, transformed the raw military sanctuary of Camelot into the undisputed diplomatic capital of Britannia. Guinevere did not come as a fragile princess, carried in a gilded carriage from a fairy tale world. She was a child of the hard northern frontier, an individual whose youth had been shaped by the sharp realities of political survival, border skirmishes, and the constant necessity of defending her ancestral lands against barbarian incursions. Her journey south to the high hill fort was a grand, deliberate procession that caught the imagination of the entire island, a moving tapestry of iron, leather, and fine wool that wound its way through the dense interior forests and across the wide wetlands. Imagine the atmosphere of Camelot on the evening of her reception, the packed clay courtyard crowded with hundreds of horsemen, infantry veterans, and common labourers who had gathered beneath the massive oak gates to witness the formal cementation of the realm. The air was thick and cold, smelling of rain-soaked earth, the rich grease used to treat the horses' hooves, and the sweet wood smoke of a dozen celebratory bonfires burning brightly along the perimeter embankments. When her escort finally halted, the synchronized thud of their iron-rimmed wooden wheels and the rhythmic stamp of their compact warhorses created a powerful cadence that resonated deeply within the timber fortifications, signaling to all who watched that the long years of tribal fragmentation were officially drawing to a close. Arthur stepped forward to receive his bride, not in the glittering regalia of a medieval emperor, but in his clean, iron-plated mail shirt and a simple cloak of dark wool dyed with native madder, his grey eyes calm and holding a profound reverence for the woman who carried the destiny of the northern alliances in her hands. Guinevere dismounted with a quiet, deliberate dignity, her long robes of heavy northern wool trailing softly in the dry straw, thrown down to stabilize the mud tracks, her face pale but unyielding beneath her simple silver circlet. The environment within the grand longhouse during the wedding feast was saturated with the intense, comforting textures of a society celebrating its absolute zenith of political harmony. Listen closely to the specific, domestic music of this unpolished feast, stepping away from the idealized, courtly romances of literature. You can hear the deep, continuous rumble of laughter from tribal chieftains who had been killing each other's kin only a winter before, now sharing large wooden platters of roasted venison fat, wild boar seasoned with wood sorrel, and round loaves of barley bread baked fresh in the citadel ovens. The air was rich with the scent of melted tallow candles burning fitfully on iron chandeliers, the sharp aroma of dark mead fermenting in oak casks, and the sweet, herbal fragrance of dried thyme and lavender scattered across the green river rushes that carpeted the floor. This marriage was the final stone in the structural framework of the kingdom, a strategic union that bound the wild, independent spears of the north to the disciplined cavalry, vanguard of the south, establishing an era of absolute security. For several magnificent years following this alliance, Camelot stood as an island of immaculate order within a chaotic world, a beacon of stability where the laws of the circle were respected, from the high granite cliffs of Cornwall to the windswept borders of the northern kingdoms. The daily administration of the realm became a smooth, rhythmic routine managed by individuals who had completely surrendered their personal ambitions to the preservation of the common peace. In the markets that developed beneath the defensive earthworks of the fortress, local merchants and foreign traders moved with absolute freedom, their wooden carts caked in the rich river silt as they brought fine wool blankets from the hills, iron agricultural tools from the forest forges, and clay jars of olive oil smuggled from the distant ports of Gaul. Listen to the vibrant, peaceful sounds that now define the rural valleys surrounding the citadel, the regular, sharp ring of iron axes, as farmers safely cleared the ancient thickets to expand their wheat fields, the melodic chanting of weavers working at their wooden spinning wheels in the small river settlements, and the soft lowing of cattle grazing in pastures that had long been abandoned to the wolves. This internal prosperity proved to the fiercely independent British clans that unity was not a constraint upon their traditional liberties, but a vital shield that guaranteed their survival against the infinite waves of Saxon raiders who continued to watch the eastern tides with hungry eyes. But history, in its rawest and most unyielding form, demonstrates that total peace is often a volatile state for a society composed of men who were born and nurtured within the fires of continuous warfare. As the years of security rolled onward into a long, quiet afternoon of stability, a subtle, psychological restlessness began to manifest itself within the timber halls of Camelot, creeping silently through the ranks of the older, battle-scarred knights who had spent their youths on the bloody field of Badon Hill. These frontier cavalrymen, individuals whose characters had been forged by the intense adrenaline of the shield wall, the frantic coordination of the midnight patrol, and the grim necessity of border defense, found themselves increasingly disoriented by the quiet routine of an ordered court. Watch them during a warm midsummer twilight as they sit at the circular table, their heavy hands resting idly upon the dark oak wood, their eyes quiet and fixed upon the dying embers of the central fire pit. They no longer wore their iron mail shirts every morning. Their iron spears stood stacked against the log posts, gathering a thin layer of soot from the torches, their leather shields softening in the damp air of the longhouse. The air inside smelled of roasted fat, stable straw, and old wine turning sour in wooden cups, a stagnant comfort that seemed to erode the sharp edge of their military discipline, creating a silent, unvoiced hunger for a purpose that could occupy their restless spirits. Merlin observed this brewing internal crisis from the quiet shadows of his private stone chamber, his cold, analytical mind understanding, long before any warlord spoke, that a society of fighters without an enemy will eventually turn its destructive energy inward upon its own foundations. He knew that the beautiful experiment of the Round Table, while magnificent in its secular justice, needed a higher, spiritual aspiration to channel the volatile passions of these riders and focus their minds upon a destination that lay beyond the material limits of tribal politics. It was during this period of quiet, anxious transition that the advisor began to circulate, whispers through the timber halls of a sacred object lost somewhere within the deep, trackless interior of the wilderness. A vessel of immense spiritual power known in the old chronicles as the magical cauldron of restoration, which later medieval poets would remold into the Holy Grail. This quest was not introduced as a pleasant literary adventure or a stylized chivalric game to entertain courtly gentlemen. It was deployed as a desperate, psychological safety valve designed to scatter the restless energy of the knights across the geography of the island, sending them on a solitary pilgrimage that would test the absolute limits of their endurance, their faith, and their sanity against the elements. Imagine the sudden, dramatic shift in the atmosphere of Camelot on the morning when the quest was formally announced. The silent tension that gripped the longhouse as night after night stepped forward to look at his reflection in the dark surface of the circular table before making his vow. They were not seeking abstract romantic glory. They were seeking a resolution to the deep, spiritual vacuum that had developed within their own hearts during the long years of peace. One by one, the elite commanders of the Federation, men like Gawain of Orkney, Bors of Gaul, and the young, intense idealists who had grown to adulthood under the security of Arthur's laws, strapped their heavy iron mail shirts over their wool tunics, took their long ash spears from the racks, and led their compact warhorses out through the timber gates of the fortress. Watch them as they ride away from the citadel in the weak, pale light of a late autumn dawn, their figures wrapped in heavy grey cloaks to keep out the freezing rain, moving in different directions toward the trackless forests and the misty lowlands of the interior. The sound of their departure was a slow, solitary rhythm, the hollow clop of a single horse's hooves sinking deep into the wet moss of the trail, the metallic whisper of a chainmail sleeve shifting against a leather saddle, and the low sigh of the wind moving through the dying leaves of the oak canopy. The departure of these finest, most reliable commanders left a profound, echoing emptiness within the grand halls of Camelot, a physical and political void that slowly transformed the vibrant centre of the Federation into a quiet fortress of anticipation and growing anxiety. The massive chairs around the circular oak table, which had once been filled by the loudest, bravest voices of Britannia, now sat empty for months at a time, their smoothed surfaces gathering a thin layer of dust in the dim light of the longhouse hearth. Arthur sat in his quiet hall during the long winter evenings, his calloused hand resting upon the empty space beside his seat. listening to the heavy timber doors rattle in the northern gale, feeling the subtle, cold weight of a changing tide that he could not control through decrees of law or tactical maneuvers. The air inside the citadel smelled of dry wood smoke, old straw, and the damp chill that always rose from the surrounding marshlands when the freezing fog rolled in from the sea to swallow the valleys. He knew that every commander who vanished into the interior wilderness was a vanguard officer lost to the practical defense of the frontier, a dangerous depletion of their centralized military strength that did not escape the notice of the Saxon kings, who were quietly rebuilding their numbers along the eastern shores. To experience the true solitary atmosphere of this spiritual search, one must follow a lone knight as he pushes deeper into the untamed, pre-human geography of the Western Territories, far beyond the secure boundaries of Arthur's roads. The landscape was immense, silent, and unconcerned with the vows of the Round Table or chivalry. The air smelled of wet slate, decaying pine needles, and cold river stone moving through hidden gorges where the sun never reached the water. Listen to the isolated textures of his survival, the constant drip of rainwater falling from the oak canopy onto his iron helmet, the sudden crack of a branch beneath his horse's hoof, and the unhuman cry of a marsh bird across moonlit bogs. The knight was no longer fighting an enemy he can see with his eyes and strike with his iron blade. He was testing the absolute boundaries of his own psychological endurance against an environment that seemed to dissolve the very line between reality and illusion beneath the perpetual rain, forcing him to sleep in the hollows of ancient trees, with his frozen fingers curled tightly around the reins of his horse. The solitary rider, pushing deeper into the untamed geography of the Western Territories, far beyond the secure boundaries of Arthur's roads, was merely a single thread in a vast, unraveling tapestry, a silent testament to the high price of chasing after an absolute ideal in a world constructed of flesh and bone. As the heavy winter fog swallowed the remaining tracks of the interior valleys, isolating the small river settlements, the quiet sanctuary of Camelot found itself increasingly vulnerable to a different kind of invasion, a subtle, creeping decay that did not arrive with the dramatic roar of a Saxon war horn, but with the soft, venomous rustle of whispers spoken in the dark corners of the grand timber hall. The physical emptiness left behind by the companions who had vanished into the primeval forests created a heavy, oppressive atmosphere within the fortress, a space where the ancient ghosts of tribal suspicion and personal longing could quietly reclaim the minds of those who remained behind. To understand the raw reality of this transitional period, one must step completely away from the idealized courtly tapestries of medieval literature and feel the dense, suffocating tension that began to saturate the daily life of the citadel. Imagine the longhouse during the deep freeze of a northern December, when the external world is locked in ice and the air within is thick with the sour smell of old mead turning to vinegar in wooden cups, the pungent odour of melting fat from tallow candles, and the heavy wood smoke of green ash logs smouldering fitfully in the central dirt pit. It was into this watchful, claustrophobic environment that Lancelot eventually returned, his body deeply weathered by the exhausting trials of his initial questing, his iron mail shirt caked in the reddish rust of the lowlands, and his face marked by the gaunt, hollow lines of an individual who had stared too long into the absolute loneliness of the wilderness. He did not return with a sacred vessel of restoration or a declaration of spiritual triumph. He rode back through the massive oak gates of the citadel as a silent survivor, his compact warhorse limping slightly against the frozen grey clay of the courtyard, his iron-braced shield heavily notched by unnamed conflicts in the dark forests. Watch him as he dismounts in the pale, watery light of the winter morning, his rough fingers trembling slightly as he unties the leather reins, his boots caked in the sticky grey mud of the frontier valleys. He did not seek the companionship of the remaining chieftains or offer a tactical report of his journey to the king. His quiet, instinctive movement drew him toward the central hearth, where Queen Guinevere sat upon her rough-carved wooden seat, her long wool robes trailing softly in the dried mountain straw that carpeted the floor. The unspoken connection between the elite foreign commander and the Northern Queen had ceased to be a private sanctuary of shared understanding. Under the relentless pressure of the court's isolation, it transformed into a dangerous current that vibrated through the timber beams of the longhouse, an invisible fracture at the very apex of imperial authority that everyone in the room could feel, but no one dared to name aloud. Arthur was not a blind or undisciplined sovereign. His long years of navigating the volatile psychology of the British clans had given him an absolute sensitivity to the subtle shifts of loyalty and emotion within his household, and he recognized long before a single rumor was whispered that the two individuals he trusted most were bound by a devotion that rivaled his own mandate. Yet, the heavy legacy of his Romano-British training required him to wrap his personal grief in absolute silence, understanding that to enforce the brutal laws of treason against his general and his queen would be to personally dismantle the magnificent edifice of peace he had built with blood and iron. If Lancelot was disgraced, the cavalry vanguard would lose its finest tactical mind, leaving the southern shores open to the Saxon longboats. If Guinevere was condemned, her powerful northern kinsmen would pull down the dragon banner and march back to their hill forts, casting Britannia into open civil war. Watch the old king as he stands alone upon the high ramparts of the palisade at twilight, his fingers pressing into the wet logs, his eyes fixed upon the marshes as the grey fog rises from the dark water to swallow the remaining contours of the land, choosing to endure the slow erosion of his personal happiness so that the ordinary farmers could farm their fields for one more winter without fear. But where a sovereign chooses the immense discipline of silence to preserve the life of a nation, there are always those who perceive that very restraint as a terminal vulnerability to be ruthlessly exploited for personal advancement and the systematic restoration of the old, bloody hierarchies of power. Out of the cold, dark corners of Arthur's own lineage stepped a young, ambitious warlord named Mordred, an individual whose presence within the old chronicles represents the absolute subversion of the Camelot ideal. In the earliest Celtic whispers, Mordred was not a cartoonish villain cloaked in theatrical black armor. He was a man of the transition, a prince raised in the rigid, unyielding tribal cultures of the distant north, whose mind had been systematically nurtured upon the bitter, sour milk of a generational grudge against the Romano-British order. He possessed none of the sacred reverence for the Round Table Oath. He looked at the circle of oakwood not as a beautiful manifestation of human equality and shared sacrifice, but as an unnatural, fragile cage that prevented the strong from ruthlessly ruling over the weak through force. Mordred observed the empty chairs around the table, the growing exhaustion of the king, and the dangerous, magnetic tension between Lancelot and Guinevere, recognizing with a predatory precision that the perfect kingdom was ripe for a terminal rupture from within, a disaster that could be engineered by simply forcing the private reality into the public square. With cold, calculating discipline, the young warlord began to establish a quiet network of surveillance throughout the log corridors of the fortress, gathering a faction of younger, restless chieftains who had grown completely bored by the long peace and who resented the strict legal reforms Arthur had imposed upon their clans. These younger warriors had never witnessed the terrifying reality of a Saxon invasion or felt the desperate panic of a burning village. They looked at the strict codes of the Federation, which forbade the ancient traditions of cattle raiding, personal plunder, and private blood feuds, as an insulting constraint upon their personal liberties. Mordred sat with them in the dim, smoky taverns that clustered beneath the defensive earthworks of the citadel, where the air smelled of roasting mutton fat, stale ale, and the damp wool of coats caked in river silt. His voice was a low, seductive murmur that cut through the crackle of the green pine logs burning in the shallow pits. He told them that Arthur's dream of an equal society, where the law ruled over the sword, was a foolish, foreign Roman illusion that denied them their true warrior heritage, systematically turning their natural restlessness into a volatile engine of political rebellion, waiting patiently for the perfect opportunity to force the king's hand and drag the hidden fractures of the court out into the open light of day. Listen closely to the specific, dark atmosphere of this brewing betrayal as it unfolded during a tense winter council meeting within the Grand Timber Hall, when the northern gale was howling outside the walls, driving the freezing sleet through the narrow gaps in the split-shingle palisades. The fire pit in the centre of the room burned with a low blood-red intensity, throwing long, predatory shadows against the massive oak posts that supported the heavy thatch roof. The air inside smelling strongly of wet wool cloaks, stale grease, and the sharp copper scent of weapons being quietly maintained in the dark straw. Mordred did not step forward with a roar of open defiance or a declaration of military rebellion. He stood in the dimness just beyond the warmth of the hearth, his fingers casually resting upon the iron pommel of his short northern sword, his eyes fixed with a cold amusement upon the face of the king. When he finally spoke, his voice was a soft, venomous current that cut through the continuous murmur of the wind, presenting the council with undeniable proof of the Queen's private meetings and the commander's compromise. He deliberately framed the personal connection between Lancelot and Guinevere, not as a private tragedy of human frailty, but as a supreme act of treason against the laws of the Federation, forcing Arthur into a desperate corner where the sovereign must either enforce the brutal letter of the law against his own household, or stand exposed before the chieftains as a compromised, weak ruler who placed his personal affections above the collective justice of the table. The trap was executed with finality, and the fragile peace that had guarded the population of Britannia for a golden generation shattered like brittle ice beneath the heavy stamp of an iron boot. In the frantic, chaotic hours that followed the public accusation, the interior of Camelot erupted into an open, bloody conflict that turned former companions into lethal enemies within the narrow log corridors of their own sanctuary. Lancelot operated within this frontier crisis with the grim efficiency of an elite heavy horseman, drawing his broad iron sword not to claim the crown or challenge the king, but to cut a path through the guards and rescue the queen from the traditional sentence of execution by fire. Listen to the sudden, shocking clash of steel echoing through the timber longhouse, the heavy, metallic scrape of chainmail shirts colliding in the dark, the frantic shouting of men who had stood side by side against the Saxons, now spilling each other's blood in the dried straw of the floor, and the terrified screaming of the horses in the stables below as the panic spread through the fortress. Lancelot succeeded in breaking through the perimeter defences, mounting his powerful warhorse and carrying Guinevere out into the freezing winter night, heading south toward the coastal waters to seek safety and exile across the waves in Gaul. But the moral unity of the Round Table was dissolved forever, leaving behind an open wound that could never be mended by laws or mercy. Mordred utilised the immediate chaos and grief of the royal household to accelerate his political campaign, systematically stepping into the vacuum of authority left behind as Arthur gathered his remaining loyal horsemen to pursue the exiled commander across the sea. The young rebel moved through the northern hill forts and western valleys like an infection, appealing directly to the ancient tribal greeds and regional rivalries that had lain dormant during the golden years of Camelot's supremacy. He told the local chieftains that the king's obsession with a universal law had made them weak, and to guarantee his victory over the returning vanguard, Mordred committed an unspeakable act of cultural betrayal, sending couriers across the North Sea to offer southern land to the Saxon kings if they would land their longboats and join his rebellion. The golden afternoon of Britannia was over, and the cold night was returning with the speed of an incoming tide, leaving the remaining loyal knights to sit in silence on the wooden decks of their ships as they sailed back toward the white cliffs, their whetstones clicking a slow rhythm against their blades, preparing for a final confrontation that would mark the definitive collapse of the once and future king. As the dark hulls of the returning fleet ground heavily against the wet gravel of the southern shores, hidden beneath the thick, suffocating embrace of the coastal mist, the remaining loyal knights stepped down into the freezing surf with an unvoiced, crushing realization that the land they had crossed oceans to save was already bleeding to death from its own internal wounds. The gentle, rhythmic lap of the channel waves offered no sanctuary to their weary spirits, for every veteran who pulled his compact warhorse onto the grey stones understood that the magnificent dream of the Round Table had officially dissolved into a grim, unyielding struggle for raw cultural survival. The grand alliance of the British clans was entirely shattered, its delicate frameworks of universal law and mutual protection replaced by a volatile resurgence of ancient tribal vendettas, while the smoke from burning lowland villages rose lazily into the cold autumn sky to merge with the low, leaden canopy of the clouds. to look past the flawless, romanticized chivalry of later medieval literature and touch the truest, most devastating reality of this final campaign, you must feel the biting chill of the salt spray, mingling with the pungent odor of scorched thatch and wet leather that saturated the atmosphere of the frontier. Arthur stood upon the shoreline, his long grey hair whipped by the relentless northern gale, his rough hand pressing heavily into the iron pommel of his broadsword as he listened to the urgent, fragmented reports of his scouts who had risked their lives to track Mordred's rapid advance through the interior valleys. The rebel warlord had not merely gathered a handful of discontented chieftains, he had engineered a massive, unnatural coalition by offering vast tracts of fertile southern territory to the Saxon kings, unleashing an infinite wave of maritime raiders who were now marching side by side with native Britons beneath a banner of open defiance, determined to systematically erase the old king's legacy from the face of the earth. The march inland toward the desolate, fog-choked valley of Camelot was a slow, mournful progression caked in the thick, freezing mud of the wetlands, a journey where the rhythmic, metallic music of their earlier triumphs was replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to contract the very horizons around the army. Listen closely to the specific, atmospheric textures of this doomed vanguard as it wound its way through the narrow contours of the western ridges, stepping away from the stylized, cinematic descriptions of modern adaptations. You can hear the continuous, low-pitched groan of wooden supply wagons caked in grey clay as their iron-rimmed wheels strained against the deep ruts of the flooded tracks. The synchronous, hollow thud of hundreds of horseshoes sinking into the wet river moss, and the steady, heavy breathing of men who carried the exhaustion of a lifetime of warfare within their chainmail shirts. The air along the line of march smelled strongly of rain-soaked wool, the animal fat used to preserve the iron rings of their armour from the creeping rot of the climate, and the sharp, bitter scent of wet charcoal from abandoned hearths left behind by fleeing peasants. Arthur rode at the head of this silent column, his face an unyielding mask of Romano-British discipline, his grey eyes fixed permanently upon the distant opening of the valley, a leader who understood with absolute clarity that he was no longer fighting to preserve an empire, but to execute a final, necessary sentence of cosmic justice upon the individual who had brought the darkness back to Britannia. When the Loyalist forces finally established their defensive positions along the rugged southern ridges of Camelot, the landscape was completely consumed by a motionless, claustrophobic autumn fog that reduced the visible world to a narrow, terrifying arena of shifting shadows and muffled echoes. To experience the authentic, terrifying atmosphere of this legendary confrontation, imagine standing within the front ranks of Arthur's shield wall, just as the first weak rays of dawn attempt to pierce through the dense white air. The environment was utterly saturated with a freezing dampness that numbed the fingers and made the iron nasal guards of their helmets icy to the touch. The unique sensory landscape defined by an absolute suspension of natural movement. The air smelled of wet slate, the stale sweat of men who had slept in their armour for 3 consecutive nights, and the sharp, copper aroma of blood tar used by the craftsmen to seal the wooden grips of their circular shields against the moisture. Across the invisible expanse of the marshy valley floor, the silence was broken, not by the inspiring call of trumpets or noble challenges, but by a deep, guttural vibration that seemed to rise from the mud itself, the rhythmic, animalistic chanting of the Saxon mercenary bands mixing with the high, frantic war cries of the northern clans who had broken their sacred oaths to the table, their collective voices creating a suffocating wall of sound that tested the psychological resilience of every soldier who held the line beneath the red dragon banner. The initial collision of the two armies occurred with an explosive, chaotic violence that instantly shattered any remaining illusion of military coordination, reducing the Great Battle of Camelot to a primitive, blind slaughter conducted within the white blindness of the mist. As the rebel infantry surged up the clay slope, the sound of the impact was a deafening, continuous roar, the splintering crack of hundreds of heavy ash spears shattering simultaneously against limewood shields, the brutal, metallic ring of iron broadswords colliding with iron helmets, and the wet, heavy thud of human bodies collapsing into the dark, sticky mud of the ditches. The fog made it completely impossible for Arthur or his commanders to direct the movement of their units, turning the battlefield into a decentralized labyrinth of hand-to-hand combat, where survival was dictated entirely by personal instinct and the immediate momentum of the shield wall. Listen to the desperate texture of this struggle as the hours wore onward without resolution. The frantic, slippery scraping of leather boots trying to find traction on hillsides, caked in blood and wet clay. The ragged white gasps of air torn from the lungs of men who fought until their muscles failed them completely, and the low, mournful groaning of wounded horses thrashing helplessly in the stagnant pools of the marshland below. It was a mutual annihilation where old friends who had stood side by side against the barbarians on Badon Hill now tore each other apart in the confusion of the fog, their shared past completely erased by the primal necessity of the immediate strike. Arthur fought at the absolute centre of this swirling vortex of iron and mist, his movements deliberate, economical, and defined by the unyielding discipline of his early frontier training, his long cavalry blade carving a lethal path through the ranks of the rebels who attempted to breach his position. He did not look like a radiant, mythical monarch wielding an enchanted weapon. He was an aging commander whose mail shirt was stained with the grey clay of the valley and the dark blood of his former subjects, his breath coming in shallow, painful wheezes through the iron grate of his visor. Through a sudden, drifting rift in the white pillars of the fog, his eyes finally locked onto the distant form of Mordred, who stood upon a low embankment of packed earth, surrounded by a tight guard of Saxon huscarls, his face twisted into an expression of cold, ambitious triumph as he watched the systematic dismantling of his father's kingdom. The sight of the rebel prince triggered a profound, visceral reaction within the old king, a sudden release of all the silent grief, the suppressed betrayals, and the immense weariness he had carried in secret for 20 years. Watch Arthur as he drives his iron spurs into the bleeding flanks of his tired warhorse, the powerful beast plunging desperately through the stagnant water of the drainage channels, clearing a path through the grasping hands of the infantry until father and son stood face to face in the quiet, isolated centre of the storm, completely separated from the wider chaos of the field. The final confrontation between the two leaders was stripped of all poetic ornament and dramatic dialogue, operating instead as a fast, unvarnished collision of raw muscle, iron, and generational hatred beneath the dark, unconcerned canopy of the autumn sky. Arthur advanced with the heavy, unbending momentum of a dying civilization, his long ash spear driving forward with an absolute, lethal precision that bypassed Mordred's iron-braced shield and pierced directly through the center of his leather breastplate, pinning the young rebel to the blood-soaked clay of the ridge. But even as the cold iron tore through his lungs, ending his dreams of supreme command, Mordred found a final, convulsing burst of malice within his heritage. He slid his body brutally along the shaft of the embedded spear, closing the distance between them until he could lift his short northern sword and bring it down with a terrifying, crushing force upon the side of Arthur's helmet. The steel blade shattered the iron nasal guard, cutting deeply into the king's brow and fracturing the bone beneath before Mordred collapsed back onto the red earth, his eyes rolling blankly into the grey mist as his breath left him forever. Arthur fell heavily beside the body of his mount, his fingers trailing loosely in the freezing water of the marsh, his blood dark and steaming as it poured into the stagnant pool below. While a sudden, absolute silence fell across the valley of Camelot, as if the land itself had run out of breath at the definitive expiration of the Golden Age. The rebel host, seeing the physical destruction of the leader who had promised them personal plunder and tribal independence, broke their formations and scattered into the dense interior forests, leaving the desolate valley entirely populated by the quiet dead, a sprawling cemetery of broken shields, abandoned banners, and shattered spears that would be buried by the autumn leaves long before the winter frost arrived to seal the ground. Out of the hundreds of elite cavalry riders who had sworn the sacred oath of the Round Table within the timber halls of Camelot, only a solitary companion remained alive to navigate the immediate aftermath of the disaster, a veteran knight named Bedivere, whose family had guarded the windswept granite cliffs of Cornwall since the departure of the legions. Imagine the intense, suffocating loneliness of that late afternoon as Bedivere slowly crawled through the red mud, his own mail shirt torn and his left arm useless, searching through the quiet rows of the fallen until he located the broken form of his sovereign, resting against the flank of his dead warhorse. The air was thick, cold, and completely motionless, smelling strongly of wet clay, old leather, and the iron scent of copper that always lingers when a civilization bleeds to death upon its own soil. Bedivere lifted the groaning king onto his shoulders, his boots sinking deep into the treacherous moss of the valley trail as he carried the dying monarch away from the field of slaughter, heading toward the silent expanse of a nearby lake whose black waters were as still as polished glass, waiting for the final act of a trust to be executed in the dark. This solitary retreat from the bloody field marked the absolute collapse of the Federation, a quiet ending to an era of unyielding hope where the remaining knight walked beneath the heavy weight of an empire that had turned completely to dust. Every step away from the rows of silent bodies felt like a descent into a deeper night, a physical journey through a broken landscape where the wind seemed to mourn the tattering of their sacred bond. Every step away from the rows of silent bodies felt like a descent into a deeper night, a physical journey through a broken landscape where the wind seemed to mourn the tattering of their sacred bond. Sir Bedivere staggered beneath the immense, unyielding weight of his dying sovereign, his leather boots sinking deep into the waterlogged moss and freezing clay of the valley tracks as the pale autumn twilight faded into a profound, perpetual darkness. The chaotic roar of the battlefield had completely vanished behind them, replaced by a suffocating stillness that seemed to contract the entire geography of Britannia into the immediate, agonizing space shared by the last two survivors of the Round Table. Listen closely to the raw, visceral textures of this quiet retreat, stripping away any remaining layer of romanticized folklore to feel the authentic exhaustion of a collapsing civilization. You can hear the uneven, raspy rhythm of Bedivere's breathing echoing within the cold iron grate of his helmet, the wet, heavy scraping of his torn chainmail shirt dragging over Arthur's fractured breastplate, and the low, continuous sigh of the northern gale moving through the barren thorn thickets. The air around them was saturated with the pungent, copper scent of dark blood pouring from the king's shattered temple, blending with the dense, sour odour of stagnant marsh water and decaying oak leaves caked along the perimeter of the ditches. There was no grand entourage of standard bearers or standard shields to guard their path. There was only a solitary soldier carrying the broken container of a magnificent dream, away from the slaughter of Camelot, moving blindly toward a destination dictated by the ancient spiritual currents of the island. They eventually reached the edge of a deep, isolated lake, whose black waters were perfectly motionless, its vast surface stretching out into the grey haze like a sheet of polished slate that refused to reflect the pale light of the dying stars. A solitary, twisted oak tree stood upon the rocky shoreline, its ancient branches bare and gnarled by centuries of coastal storms, its roots driven deep into the gravel beds to claim a permanent sanctuary against the elements. Bedivere lowered the groaning king gently against the rough bark of the tree, his hands trembling with both the freezing cold and the crushing reality of an era officially coming to its end, beneath the low canopy of the winter clouds. The environment around the lake was defined by an absolute suspension of natural movement, a landscape where the boundaries between earth and water seemed to dissolve entirely into the damp air, creating a natural amphitheatre of silent grief. Arthur's eyes opened weakly, his grey hair caked with the dark red clay of the marshland, his fingers trembling as they reached down to touch the hilt of the sword that had become the ultimate physical manifestation of his divine mandate to rule. The weapon carried no shimmering jewels or magical runes on its crossguard. It was a pragmatic cavalry broadsword, its polished steel face heavily notched by the unyielding discipline of a dozen frontier campaigns, yet still catching the pale watery glow of the horizon. The old king looked up at his companion, his voice a low, painful whisper that was barely louder than the rustle of the dry grass along the shoreline, commanding Bedivere to take the heavy iron blade, to walk out onto the lonely stone jetty that projected into the black water and to hurl the weapon into the deep center of the pool. To find the deep, psychological reality beneath this fateful instruction is to observe the immense, paralyzing hesitation that immediately gripped the heart of the remaining knight as his fingers closed around the cold leather grip of the sword. Bedivere stood upon the slippery gravel of the beach, the weight of the weapon in his hand feeling heavier than the shield he had carried through the fires of civil war, his mind completely overwhelmed by the realization of what this action truly signified. To cast this iron blade into the absolute silence of the lake was not merely to dispose of a weapon, it was to personally execute a sentence of total oblivion upon their entire history, leaving the future generations of Britannia without a single tangible monument or a single spark of hope to guide them through the dark ages that were rapidly returning to conquer the land. He looked back at the king, whose breath was coming in shallow, rattling gasps beneath his ruined armor, and felt a profound rebellion rise within his spirit, a natural human desire to preserve the sacred relics of a glorious afternoon before the night claimed everything. The knight walked slowly out onto the narrow stone pier, his boots clicking sharply against the cold grey boulders caked in dried river moss, his eyes fixed upon the smooth, deceptive surface of the open water. The air around the pier smelled strongly of wet slate, ancient peat, and the sharp, clean scent of frost settling into the reeds, an environment that seemed completely indifferent to the moral code of Camelot or the oaths sworn around the oak circle. Bedivere lifted the broadsword, intending to execute the sovereign's command, but as the steel caught the final weak ray of twilight, his arm froze in mid-air, his discipline collapsing beneath the immense historical value of the object he held. He thought of the long years of building, the sweat of the labourers who had driven the oak posts into the earth at Camelot, and the beautiful framework of justice that was now poised to vanish without a trace. He could not bring himself to hurl the ultimate symbol of British unity into the black vacuum of the deep. He lowered his arm, turned his back on the open water, and carefully concealed the weapon within the deep hollow roots of a nearby willow tree caked in frozen mud. He returned to the twisted oak where the king lay, attempting to wrap his betrayal in a defensive layer of comfortable lies, claiming that he had thrown the blade into the water and seen nothing but the ripples moving across the surface. But Arthur, whose understanding of the deep spiritual forces of his homeland had been refined by a lifetime of strategic sacrifice, looked through Bedivere's deception with a single, devastating glance of his grey eyes, his voice containing a sudden, terrible resonance that cut directly through the knight's pride. He accused his companion of being bound by a greedy vanity, a foolish desire to preserve a piece of iron, while abandoning the absolute integrity of the oath that held their world together, ordering him back to the stone jetty with a command that left no room for hesitation or denial. Twice the veteran soldier walked out onto the cold stone pier, his fingers tracing the familiar notches on the crossguard, his mind filled with the faces of Lancelot, Gawain, and the younger idealists who had once sat as equals around the oak circle, and twice his courage failed him, his heart refusing to accept that the era of Camelot was truly over. He remembered the grand assemblies in the timber longhouse, the smell of fresh green rushes on the floor, and the solemn sound of hundreds of voices speaking in unison to protect the weak. To destroy this final link felt like committing an act of treason against the memory of every companion who had bled on Baden Hill. He returned to the tree with the same empty reports, and twice the dying king rejected his words with a growing sorrow, reminding the soldier that true authority was found not in holding on to the physical remnants of power, but in the unyielding willingness to surrender everything to the larger architecture of time. When Bedivere walked out onto the stone jetty for the third time, the atmosphere around the lake had grown completely cold and dark, the winter mist thickening to hide the distant ridges and reducing the visible world to the narrow stone path beneath his feet. The weight of the king's disappointment and the absolute necessity of the trust he carried finally shattered the knight's resistance, stripping his mind of any remaining illusion that they could bargain with the past or delay the turning of the seasons. He pulled the sword from its hidden cradle within the roots, stepped to the very edge of the stone pier, and with a final, convulsing release of his physical strength, hurled the iron blade far out into the grey expanse of the open water. Watch the weapon as it twists through the silent air, a flash of cold iron turning over and over beneath the low winter clouds, its polished face reflecting the absolute finality of their collective sacrifice before it reaches the absolute height of its arc and begins its long descent toward the lake. The impact was a clean, sharp splash that broke the frozen mirror of the surface, a single metallic ring that echoed across the desolate wetlands before the black water closed completely over the hilt, swallowing the sword into the primeval geography of the island from which it had been drawn generations before. The slow, concentric rings moved outward across the dark pool, growing wider and fainter until the surface became perfectly flat and motionless once again, leaving Bedivere standing alone on the cold stones of the jetty, his hands empty, his heart hollowed out by the realization that the era of the Round Table had officially returned to the silence of the earth. The weapon was gone, reclaimed by the ancient forces that watch over the destiny of Britannia, leaving no physical relic behind to prove that there had once been a place called Camelot, where men had attempted to live by a code of universal justice and equality. He turned away from the black water, his leather boots heavy with the mud of a fallen world, walking slowly back toward the twisted oak tree to report that the sentence had been executed and the trust had been successfully returned to the deep. Arthur received the news with a quiet, peaceful sigh that seemed to dissolve the final remnants of tension from his broken body, his grey eyes closing as his breath became shallow and rhythmic beneath the shadow of the branches. He told Bedivere that his work on the frontier was complete, and that the physical frameworks they had constructed with wood and iron were meant to fade, so that the core idea of the circle could remain immortal within the memory of the survivors. Miles away from this lonely shoreline, the actual timber walls of Camelot were already starting to rot beneath the constant northern rain, the central fire pit filling with dead leaves and stagnant water, a silent skeleton of a civilization left to decay in the dark. The grand Roman roads were once again being swallowed by the creeping ivy, and the local tribal chieftains were pulling down the dragon standards to resume their ancient, petty feuds for land and cattle, proving that the deepest dangers to any order are always found within the volatile corners of the human spirit. Yet, as the king's life slipped away into the night, the silence that settled over the lake was not a void of despair. It was a watchful, protective stillness that held the promise of a distant memory, a safe container where the truth of the man could be quietly preserved beneath the rising fog, waiting for a time when the world might look into the mirror of the past and remember the meaning of an unselfish vow. The old structures were falling, the fields were returning to the wilderness, and the snow was beginning to blanket the ruins of their great hall. But the silent ground held the memory of the code deep within its frozen layers, safe from the trampling of future kings. The silent ground held the memory of the code deep within its frozen layers, safe from the trampling of future kings, while the remaining grey contours of the shoreline slowly dissolved into the vast, uniform shadow of the gathering winter night. Sir Bedivere stood perfectly motionless upon the cold stones of the narrow pier, his empty hands resting limply against his sides, his watchful eyes fixed permanently upon the exact spot where the polished iron face of the sword had broken the glass-like surface of the open water. The concentric rings that had rippled outward across the black pool had long since spent their momentum against the reeds, leaving the lake in a state of absolute, unyielding stillness that seemed to mirror the profound stagnation that had fallen upon the entire political destiny of Britannia. To look past the gilded, mystical tapestries of later folklore and touch the raw, frozen reality of this transitional hour is to feel the immense, suffocating weight of an absolute isolation that reclaimed the Western world as the last light of the sun vanished completely behind the western ridges. There were no celestial music notes or grand angelic processions waiting to receive the sovereign on this desolate shore. There was only the cold, sharp bite of the northern gale cutting through the barren oak branches, the rhythmic, melancholy lap of dark water against the river gravel, and the immense weariness of a solitary soldier who knew that he had just personally buried the final tangible anchor of his civilization. Through the heavy, motionless fog that hung low over the stagnant marshlands, a single wooden boat began to reveal its dark silhouette, gliding forward across the black expanse of the lake without the sound of dipping oars or the rustle of wind-driven canvas sails. It was not a majestic vessel of gold and silk thunglung from a fairy tale realm. It was a narrow, unornamented funeral barge, crafted from ancient, waterlogged oak planks that smelled deeply of peat bogs, river moss, and the sour smoke of old wood fires. Inside, the craft sat three quiet figures wrapped from head to foot in heavy, unadorned black wool cloaks, their faces completely hidden within the deep recesses of their hoods, their pale hands resting motionless against their laps like stone carvings. These silent women represented the ancient, pre-human spiritual custodians of the island's sacred geography, the keepers of the hollow hills who had witnessed the rise and fall of the Roman legions and who were now returning to reclaim the mortal leader they had lent to the world for a brief afternoon of order. Bedivere, his hands trembling violently from both the freezing temperature and the crushing psychological weight of the moment, carefully lifted the broken body of his sovereign from the dried straw beneath the gnarled oak tree, his torn chainmail shirt scraping softly against Arthur's fractured armour as he carried him down to the water's edge. He laid the monarch gently upon a bed of soft deer hides arranged within the centre of the barge, watching as the three cloaked figures moved forward to cradle the king's shattered head, their low, rhythmic murmuring sounding less like human speech and more like the low sigh of the wind, moving through a field of winter wheat. As the dark vessel began to drift slowly away from the stone jetty, moving silently back into the thick, protective expanse of the central mist, Arthur opened his grey eyes one final time to look at the solitary companion he was leaving behind upon the fading shoreline. His voice, when he spoke, carried no anger, no imperial command, and no regret for the catastrophic ruin of his Voon quirk. It was merely a soft, comforting whisper that drifted across the widening gap of black water like a fading echo, telling Bedivere to comfort himself and to let go of the physical remnants of a dream that had served its necessary purpose in the grand architecture of time. He commanded the remaining knight to trust that his body was journeying to the legendary island valley of Avalon, a hidden sanctuary of abundance and restoration where the old gods still watched over the deep wells to heal his grievous wounds beneath the eternal shade of the apple orchards. Watch the barge as it becomes smaller and smaller within the grey haze, a dark sliver dissolving into the vast, motionless horizon of the lowlands until the heavy curtain of the fog closes completely behind its stern, leaving the open lake perfectly empty once again in the dark. Bedivere stood alone on the wet stones, listening to the vast, hollow silence that now consumed the entire world, realizing with an unvoiced dread that he was the last living monument to an ideal that had officially vanished from the face of the earth, leaving Britannia entirely defenseless against the encroaching night. To explore the profound desolation of the years that followed the disaster at Camelot is to observe the specific, changing textures of an island sliding rapidly backward into the tattered chaos of its prehistoric past, stripped of the disciplined trut-tut that Arthur had spent his entire life building. Walk with Bedivere as he turns his back upon the silent lake and begins his long, aimless journey through the interior wilderness, his heavy leather boots caked in the sticky grey clay of the frontier tracks. The air throughout the valleys smelled strongly of wet slate, charred timber from abandoned settlements, and the stale, damp scent of hill forts left to rot beneath the constant autumn rains. There was no longer a centralized vanguard of ironclad horsemen to patrol the ridgelines. There were no couriers riding under a safe conduct to enforce the legal reforms of the Round Table across the different territories. Listen to the dark, fragmented environment that returned to reclaim the land as the memory of Camelot faded into the mist. You can hear the distant, repetitive thud of Saxon axes clearing the ancient oak groves in the east, the frantic shouting of local tribal chieftains engaging in petty border raids for cattle and plunder, and the low, mournful crying of wolves returning to hunt within the overgrown ruins of old Roman towns that had briefly known the comfort of safety. The actual fortress of Camelot was left completely empty, its massive timber palisades slowly blackening and rotting beneath the relentless northern gales. Its grand central hall filling with dead leaves and stagnant rainwater, a silent skeleton of a civilization that had dared to believe it could hold back the turning of the world's seasons. Bedivere did not seek a new master or offer his broad iron blade to any of the minor tyrants who were now squabbling for the remnants of power. He moved through the wild country as a quiet, solitary hermit cloaked in rough grey wool, carrying the sacred memory of the circle within his heart like a burning coal. He eventually found a permanent refuge within a small, isolated sanctuary built of rough fieldstones on the windswept slopes of Glastonbury Tor, a solitary hill that rose like a green island out of the vast Somerset marshes. Here, far above the chaotic, bloody feuds of the local clans, he spent his remaining decades guarding a simple, unmarked turf grave that sat beneath the shadow of a small stone cross, listening to the wind howl through the narrow gaps in the masonry as his body grew old and frail. Listen to the quiet, regular rhythm of his life in this lonely retreat. The dry scratch of his iron spade turning the cold earth of his vegetable patch, the low murmur of his evening prayers rising into the dark timber roof beams, and the steady sigh of his own breath as he waited patiently for his own blood to return to the soil. As the generations began to pass across the landscape of Britain, and the final eyewitnesses to Arthur's reign were one by one laid into the quiet earth, a strange and remarkable transformation began to occur within the collective consciousness of the surviving native people. The harsh Tranrui realities of the Civil War, the catastrophic tactical errors that had led to the slaughter at Camelot, and the devastating personal betrayals that had shattered the royal household, were slowly smoothed over and altered by the natural mechanics of historical trauma. The population huddling within the dark winter huts, fleeing from the steady, unyielding advance of the Saxon armies, did not want to remember a leader who had bled and died in the mud of a stagnant marshland. They desperately needed an immortal savior, an eternal archetype of resistance who could provide them with a psychological shield against total cultural despair. The travelling Celtic bards and storytellers began to systematically alter the ending of the tale, whispering beside the winter hearth pits that Arthur had not truly died beneath the twisted oak tree at all, but was merely resting in a deep, enchanted sleep within the hidden heart of the hollow hills, guarded by the old magic of the forest until the time was right for his return. They created the magnificent, enduring prophecy of the once and future king, a solemn promise that when Britannia reached its absolute darkest hour, the dragon standards would rise once more from the shifting air, and Arthur would return to wield his blade and restore the balance. This radical remoulding of a historical casualty into an immortal messiah is a classic example of how human societies utilize memory as a vital instrument of survival, deliberately choosing the beautiful fiction over the unyielding fact to preserve their own cultural identity across centuries of oppression. To a people facing the total erasure of their language, their laws, and their traditional lineage, the myth of the returning sovereign was infinitely more valuable than any accurate military report of a final defeat on a muddy field. It provided the spiritual strength required to endure the long centuries of foreign rule, keeping the small spark of their ancient heritage alive beneath the heavy weight of alien crowns that came to dominate the island. Watch the old story as it moves steadily through the changing centuries, adapting its armor, its location, and its language to match the anxieties and ambitions of each new era, passing from the raw Celtic war cries of Wales to the sophisticated chivalric courts of medieval Europe. The real 5th century commander Arturios had been completely dissolved into the silver mist of his own unyielding geography, leaving behind an empty vessel of memory that could be filled with the dreams, the moral values, and the political agendas of whoever held the pen. He was no longer a man of flesh and blood who had walked the muddy tracks of Somerset. He had become a constellation in the night sky of the human imagination, a timeless symbol of what humanity can achieve when it chooses to sit at a circular table and swear a common oath to protect the vulnerable. The silence that now covers the ancient battlefields and forgotten sanctuaries of the West Country is not a void of absolute emptiness, but a living, breathing landscape where the border between the physical past and the imagined legend remains tantalizingly thin for those who know how to listen. If you stand today upon the windswept heights of Glastonbury Tor as the autumn twilight begins to deepen and the grey mist rolls in from the Bristol Channel to swallow the low-lying fields below, the modern world seems to vanish entirely beneath the immense weight of the stillness. Listen closely to the subtle, natural music of this historic environment, letting the noise of your own routine fall away completely into the dark. You can hear the low, mournful sigh of the wind moving through the long, dry grass of the embankments, the distant, hollow call of a solitary heron wading within the drainage ditches of the moorland, and the quiet, continuous rustle of old oak trees dropping their acorns into the dark soil. There are no stone monuments or iron signs here to mark the exact spot where the round table stood, or where the king took his final breath beneath the branches. The truth of King Arthur does not live in stone or bronze. It lives within the very atmosphere of the land, an invisible, persistent presence that continues to whisper its ancient lessons of honor, sacrifice, and equality to anyone who has the patience to stop and listen in the dark. Every step away from the rows of silent bodies felt like a descent into a deeper night, a physical journey through a broken landscape where the wind seemed to mourn the tattering of their sacred bond. Yet, as the last remnants of that tragic day vanished into the dark, a different kind of dawn began to break over the collective memory of the Western world. The physical structures of post-Roman Britannia would eventually crumble completely under the weight of time, their massive oak palisades rotting into the rich moss of the Somerset valleys, and the iron weapons scattered across Camelot Hill, turning slowly to red rust beneath the unyielding rain. The specific names of the frontier cavalrymen who had once answered the call of the dragon banner were quietly omitted from the administrative records of the rising Saxon kingdoms, replaced by new lineages and foreign dialects that sought to anchor their own authority to the soil of the conquered island. To look past the flawless chivalric armour of medieval poetry and engage with the absolute, historical legacy of the war leader Artorios is to discover that his true victory was not the preservation of an earthly empire or the establishment of an unbroken line of kings. His genuine achievement was the protection of a light, a delicate, fragile spark of human order and systemic equality that survived the absolute collapse of a civilization, ensuring that when the long night of the early Dark Ages finally began to lift, humanity would possess a template of honor to guide its reconstruction. Over the next several centuries, as the small wooden villages grew into towns and the overgrown Roman trails were gradually cleared once more by new generations of builders, the memory of that circular table remained a vital blueprint for the developing mind of Europe, a persistent reminder that society could be organized around a shared contract rather than the unchecked whim of a single tyrant. In the immediate decades following the final battle, while the fields returned to the wilderness and families huddled in the isolated hill forts to escape the chaos, the surviving bards continued to sing of a brief period when the law protected the weak, keeping the internal spirit of the population alive when the material world had fallen to pieces. This invisible inheritance did not vanish with the sword cast into the Black Lake. It became the silent, foundational architect of modern law and governance, tracing its lineage directly back to those candlelit winter nights where fierce tribal chieftains sat as equals around a simple circle of English oak. When we look at the core structure of contemporary courts, where individuals from every station of life must stand before an impartial bar of justice, or when we observe the foundational charters that restrict the unchecked pride of modern sovereigns, we are listening to the distant, enduring resonance of Arthur's Circle. The medieval clerks, Renaissance humanists, and early constitutional thinkers who systematically drafted our legal frameworks did not merely copy the cold, rigid, administrative statutes of imperial Rome. They infused those structural skeletons with the living, breathing spirit of the Round Table Oath. They preserved the revolutionary conviction that power is only legitimate when it operates as a protective trust for the vulnerable, rather than an instrument for private extortion or territorial plunder. This moral evolution is the true monument of Camelot, an intellectual fortress built not of stone and timber, but of words, promises, and mutual obligations that outlived the very trees used to build the king's grand hall, proving that the things we dream can sometimes possess a greater durability than the things we build with our hands. The slow transition from the brutal blood feuds of the ancient clans to a structured, centralized code of equity was a direct result of that short-lived afternoon of justice, an unyielding legacy that continued to shape the definition of human dignity through the rise and fall of countless dynasties, providing a quiet framework for the protection of the humble and the maintenance of public trust. This principle of mutual accountability eventually crossed the Channel once more, influencing the formation of early parliaments and common law traditions, acting as a quiet current of restraint that continuously reminded rulers that their authority was bound to the welfare of the people they governed. Yet, the legend of the once and future king leaves us with a deeper, far more intimate obligation, a quiet mirror held up directly to the face of our own contemporary civilization as we wander through the complex, noisy routines of our daily existence. It asks us to look closely at our magnificent achievements, our towering citadels of glass and steel, and our sophisticated networks of immediate global communication, and to wonder what would truly remain if our current frameworks faced a sudden, unexpected winter of cultural isolation. The narrative of Arthur's fall serves as a timeless, protective warning, reminding every generation that when wealth turns into a hollow display of vanity, when civic responsibility is systematically traded for personal comfort, and when a society forgets to maintain the moral bridges that hold its communities together, even the most seemingly eternal institutions can dissolve into the haze of a single season. The deepest, most terminal dangers to any civilization are never found within the hostile forces gathering along the distant, unknown borders of the map. They are found within the dark, silent chambers of our own hearts, where the creeping mist of selfishness and indifference can slowly erode the sacred oaths we have made to protect one another. To remember Arthur is to remember that our true security is never guaranteed by the strength of our material weapons or the height of our defensive walls, but by the absolute fidelity of our shared discipline to treat the stranger with honor and to sit at the table as peers. We must continuously ask ourselves what values would float if our own ground were to break unexpectedly beneath our feet, forcing us to carry our laws in our bare hands through the dark, stripped of the artificial comforts and illusions of permanent stability that often blind us to our mutual dependence. The architectural wonders of our modern cities can offer us no sanctuary if we allow the invisible foundations of empathy and civic trust to rot from within, leaving behind a hollow shell that cannot withstand the heavy shifting of history's tides. Let the restless rhythm of your thoughts slow down entirely now, matching the steady, peaceful cadence of the natural world as the night reclaims the ancient landscapes of the West, wrapping the valleys in a deep, perpetual blanket of rest. Picture the vast oak forests of Britain as they stand silent beneath the silver light of a midwinter moon, their great gnarled branches bare and heavy with the gathering frost, yet holding deep within their hidden roots the invisible promise of a distant, inevitable spring. Think of the quiet merchant vessels gliding through the dark coastal waters of the Channel, their lanterns flickering weakly against the long, rhythmic rollers of the grey sea, guided safely toward the shore by the same timeless landmarks that Arthur's horsemen scanned from their windswept hill forts 15 centuries ago. The past is not a dead territory separated from us by an impassable gulf of years. It is a fluid, continuous stream that flows quietly beneath the surface of our current lives, its ancient current shaping our languages, our dreams, and our deepest definitions of what it means to be noble. The great circle remains unbroken, waiting patiently in the stillness for anyone who wishes to turn their back on the noise of the marketplace and find their way to the quiet center of the circle, where the old vows are safe and the light never fully goes out. The modern roads may have replaced the muddy tracks of the frontier, and the stone cities may have covered the ancient swamps, but the underlying earth remains unchanged. A deep, watchful presence that remembers the passing of the legions, the building of the timber forts, and the soft breathing of the men who slept with their fingers frozen around the iron hilts of their swords. Let your mind historically detach itself from the continuous friction of the waking hours, sinking into the wide, timeless expanse of an island that has survived the rise and fall of multiple empires without losing its internal quietness. The dark barge that carried the wounded king away from the slaughter of Camelot has long since dissolved into the grey waters of human memory, and the legendary blade Excalibur lies buried beneath the deep silt of a silent pool, its polished edge hidden from the sight of mortal eyes, until the world is ready to receive its truth once more. But the promise of his return continues to live on as a permanent constellation in the night sky of the human spirit, a beautiful reminder that no great ideal is ever truly lost to the darkness, even when its walls are broken and its banners are torn to shreds by the winds of change. The dream of Camelot is a sanctuary that can never be conquered by time or steel, a place of perfect refuge that exists wherever an individual chooses to put aside their personal pride, to listen to the quiet whispering of their conscience, and to offer their strength to the defense of a weary traveler. As the final embers of the fire pit burn out, casting their low, comforting red glow across the logs of the longhouse, the distinction between what was real and what was dreamed dissolves entirely into the velvet stillness of the midnight hour, leaving behind only a great, encompassing peace that guards your rest. The footsteps of history have all faded from the forest floor. The ancient signal horns have fallen silent across the ridges, and the long journey through the whispering fog of Britannia is successfully complete for tonight. Allow your body to completely soften into the heavy warmth of your bedding. Let your breathing find its natural, deep rhythm, and feel the absolute security of the quiet space around you. As the dark hours carry you forward into a restful sleep, the stories have all returned to the soil, the old vows are safe within the keeping of the night, and there are no more paths left to wander until the return of the morning sun. Only the memory remains. Only the story endures, wrapping your mind in a gentle shroud of peace that will carry you safely through the midnight hours. Breathe out the lingering tension of the day, listen to the silent whisper of the wind outside your window, and let yourself float away into the deep, unyielding stillness of the evening. The gnarled trees in the forest continue their slow winter breathing. The dark water of the lake rests undisturbed beneath the low canopy of the stars, and the ancient hills hold the secrets of the kings in a state of perpetual quietness. Let your eyes grow completely heavy. Allow the drifting mist of the past to smooth over the anxieties of the present and sink down into the deep, comforting embrace of an absolute silence that has waited 1,000 years to guard your peaceful rest. Your long journey through the landscape of memory is completed. The fire is reduced to a soft grey ash, and the darkness holds nothing but the profound security of a well-earned tranquility that will remain unbroken until the dawn. The ancient lake stands as a permanent liquid vault of history, its quiet depths guarding the iron legacy of an era that refused to surrender its values to the surrounding chaos. You can sleep safely now, knowing that the structural pillars of that great dream are preserved within the very ground beneath you, a silent sanctuary that remains untouchable by the modern storms. Good night,